Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey, since 1974, but it's your 10th anniversary of being leader here at New York Society, so thank you. He's if I can call you an activist, Joe, educator and writer for human rights causes. Your CV is as long as my arm, if not both, so I'm not going to read a whole lot, but really topically now you serve as president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers. And this is really close to home at the moment throughout the states, I know. You know, this is one of the major organizations that provides services for these asylum seekers who are released from, it's a lucky, from federal detention. So who better than to attend and address this morning's talk? Glorious visions. Visions. Well, let's hope it's visions. Glorious visions. An America beyond tribalism. Joe, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good to see you all today. Happy Mother's Day. Let me add my warm wishes to all of you who are mothers, and I hope your children are good to you today, especially good. I noticed maybe Mother's Day accounts for our smaller attendance today. Usually we're a little bit sparse, and I suspect people are spending the day with their families, which is a good reason not to be here, I guess, if we're looking for a reason not to be here. So anyway, consider yourself the most devoted members of the society. It is good to be here, and I'm going to talk again about a topic which I think is the issue of our time, and I'm going to be talking more about moving beyond tribalism than I am glorious visions. But I think it's something that we really need to dedicate ourselves to and need to be very mindful of. Let me mention, yes, it is 10 years since I became a very part-time leader of the New York Society, but I must say, I think it was, if my memory serves me well, it was 50 years this month when I joined the New York Ethical Society. So it's been a half century of affiliation on and off. I was here for 2 years and then became a leader in training and have served most of my work in the ethical movement across the Hudson River in New Jersey at the Bergen Society, and then now work here as well, very happily, at the New York Society on a part-time basis. Okay, so it is. One of my favorite pastimes, which is also a minor obsession for me, is reading book reviews. I am fascinated by ideas, and I find that book reviews are an excellent conveyance to learn about what smart people are thinking. Not only do I find the review, which comes just at the right size, often engaging and informative, it also cues me into what I want to add to my nightstand, which is always overflowing with books yet to be read, right? I'm sort of a bibliomaniac. I mean, a trend which takes the form of, indeed, a biblio-avalanche these days is the current outpouring of books about democracy, all of them veering towards the negative. They come in such titles as How Democracies Die, Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. How Democracy Ends. Suicide of the West, How the Rebirth of Tribalism, Populism, Nationalism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, and just when you were feeling a little bit depressed, to lift your spirits, appearing just recently on the New York Times bestseller list, is a book by our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, called, quote, Fascism, a Warning. Okay, I actually have a copy of it. I've started to read it here. Okay, one may think what one chooses, but it's my contention that these new releases are not merely cashing in on a self-created literary fad. It's my sober belief that they are responding to something very real that is occurring around the world, and most significantly right here in America. I say most significantly because the United States remains the 800-pound gorilla on the world scene, and where America moves, much of the world will follow. We set and sustain global trends. Yet when it comes to the warnings these books pronounce, the United States is not only a driver and legitimator of global trends, it is woven into them as well. I was a child in the McCarthy era. I was a participant in the turbulent 1960s that was rife with urban riots, the violence that accompanied the civil rights struggles, the political assassinations, the virulence of the anti-war movement, and we all survived potential annihilation threatened by the Cold War and lived through the moral abominations of Richard Nixon. But I must confess personally, I have never been more frightened about the future of my country than I am right now at this moment. I need to be clear. I do not think that America will end as a result of an external threat or foreign enemy. Terrorism will not do us in, and North Korea's nuclear arsenal is not yet deployable and is minuscule compared to the hundreds of nuclear weapons aimed at us across the Atlantic by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Nor do I believe that the United States will disappear from the map as a political entity like a latter-day Ottoman Empire. Rather, the danger, as these book titles suggest, is the endurance of the United States as a democracy. Like a fish that is unaware of its aquatic environment because it is surrounded by it and so has nothing to compare itself to, we take our democratic form of government for granted. It is all that we have known, and we live presuming as it has existed yesterday, so it will exist tomorrow and into the far horizons of the future. We take democracy as a way of life, as a given. It's as solid and as enduring as the proverbial Rock of Gibraltar. But recent events, global and domestic, I argue, should challenge that complacency. We are the world's oldest democracy, but there is no determinism in this. Democracies come and go, and indeed the history of the past 200 years tells us that democracies have appeared, disappeared, and then appeared elsewhere again. In the long range, however, the news appears to be very good. Democracy has spread with modernization. In the 19th century, there were very few democracies. Today, of the 193 nations in the UN, about 90 of them are democracies. But this expansion has not been unilateral. After World War I, the number of democracies grew substantially. And then again after World War II. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a surge in democracies, leading some optimists to believe that liberal democracy would be the human future for all time. The age of ideology and ideological competition that has fueled history had come to an end in our lifetime. But there were periods of retreat within this larger expansion. The greatest of these came in the 1930s, when fascism spread over much of Europe. We are now in the period of democracy's greatest retreat since the 1930s, and I think we should all be very, very concerned. Democratic states have always had within them authoritarian political parties. After World War II, they were largely discredited. From 1945 to 1959, such authoritarian parties in 32 democratic countries drew about 7% of the vote in those countries. In the 1960s and 70s, the popularity of such right-wing parties fell even further to about 5% of the vote. They were essentially on the fringe. But in the 1980s, things began to change, and support for authoritarian parties began to surge. According to a Ronald Inglehart, who is an academic, he teaches at the University of Michigan and is a professor of democracy and human rights. According to Ronald Inglehart, writing in the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, in those 32 two democracies, authoritarian parties were on the average drawing more than 12% of the vote. In such liberal bastions as Denmark, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, authoritarian parties became the largest or second largest political bloc. In Austria, in the 2016 presidential vote, the candidate of the far-right Freedom Party, a fellow by the name of Norbert Hofer, narrowly lost with 46% of the vote. In France, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right National Front, won 34% in last year's presidential election in France. Since the Second World War, Germany, because of its history of Nazism, has long had an aversion to authoritarian xenophobic parties. But in 2017, the authoritarian xenophobic Alternative for Germany party won 13% of the vote, becoming Germany's third largest political party. And bringing it home, as we know, Donald Trump, running on a xenophobic platform with strong authoritarian propensities, won 46% of the vote and took the Electoral College, as we know very well. This is the story in the stable democracies, those with which we have had the longest standing affinities. But the current wave of authoritarianism extends much more broadly around the globe. After the fall of communism, there was a great deal of hope that Poland, with its solidarity movement, which after all helped hasten the fall of the Soviet Union, would democratize and fully join the European community. But what we witness in Poland and in Hungary as well is an authoritarian reversal and what is often referred to as illiberalism. Elections are indeed held, but in both Poland and Hungary, an independent judiciary has all but been destroyed, individual liberties curtailed, and in Poland, the media have been turned into a propaganda arm for the government. Checks and balances, which are a mainstay of democratic governance, have all but disappeared. Power in both countries is consolidated more exclusively in the executive branch. Whereas Germany has taken in almost 1 million refugees from the Middle East and North Africa in the last few years, the nations of Eastern Europe have taken in almost none. And Donald Trump is not unique. Hungary, in fact, has built a wall on its southern border to keep immigrants and refugees out of that country. The post-war dream of a united Europe without boundaries is being shredded under the pressures of parochialism, populism, nationalism, authoritarianism, and xenophobia. Putin's Russia, of course, is becoming increasingly autocratic. The recent election, which reinstalled Putin to the presidency, was universally understood both in Russia and outside of it as a sham. To be a journalist in Russia today is a very dangerous profession. One may end up finding that one's criticism of the government end you up on a government hit list. And in Russia, and this we should look at, there hasn't been enough press on this, the assault on gays, the physical violence against gays, and legal discrimination against gays with the support of the Orthodox Church in Russia is very widespread. There's no legislation in Russia protecting homosexuals against discrimination. And outside of Africa, the Muslim world, and parts of Asia, hatred of gays in Russia is the most virulent in the world. Okay? In Turkey, Recep Erdogan is making his country look like other one-man rule Middle Eastern autocracies. He has virtually taken over the press, jailed critics, sidelined the military, which historically has been the guardian of Turkish secularism, and with it, Turkey under Erdogan is becoming increasingly Islamicized. In India, the world's largest, second largest country, and its largest democracy, in India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is leader of the Hindu Nationalist Party, the major objective of which is to turn this vast pluralistic society into officially a Hindu state. I mean, the government of India is a secular government. Nehru had ensured that the state of India is secular, and India has always been very pluralistic. It has about, I would think, about 78% of the population is Hindu, But you know, it's interesting, India is also the world's third largest Muslim population. The minority of Muslims, it's a minority, are over 170 million. 2.5% of India is Christian. There are Jain, Buddhist, and Sikh minorities, as well as other minorities in India. And so India has always been, although predominantly Hindu, of course, has always been a pluralistic state, and yet the Hindu Nationalist Party, which goes back well over 100 years, indeed the assassin of Mohandas Gandhi was a Hindu nationalist, in effect, has a long history, deep history in India, is to basically proclaim and fulfill what's known as the ideology in Hindi of Hindutva, which is the turning of India into a Hindu, officially a Hindu state. Under Modi's leadership, which is very ego-driven, there's been an increase of violence. There's always violence against minorities, but there's been an increase of violence against the Muslim minority, which lives in great fear. And indeed in India, for example, one example of anti-Muslim sentiment is the banning of the sale of beef in India. Now, this may seem to us like a fringe issue, but it's a very big issue and a very contentious issue in India. Okay, not only is it a violation of India's official secularism in the name of religion, but it practically discriminates against Muslims, not only socially, but also economically, since many Muslims make their living through selling beef, okay? And the beef industry actually is very large in India, and this may come as a surprise, even though beef eating the cow is sacred in Hinduism and beef eating is forbidden in Hinduism. Many Hindus, especially in South India, do regularly consume beef, despite what their religion may teach. So the attack on the beef industry has repercussions, economic, social, cultural, and religious, and political, which are very significant in that country. And there are other forms of discriminatory practice, which is trying again to elevate Hinduism into the official state position. In China, after the death of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping not only installed a capitalist economy, but he set term limits on China's top leaders, term limits so that the top leader autocrat could indeed serve only 2 5-year terms with a mandatory retirement age of 70. The current president, Xi Jinping, is attempting to establish himself, indeed, as we might know, as the dictator for life in China, abandoning Deng's system of predictable nonviolent succession. Not claiming China is a democracy, but it is moving towards, again, one-man rule and even concentrating greater power in the hands of the autocrat. Israeli society has turned far to the right. The Israeli left and the peace movement in Israel have been greatly diminished. But the current Netanyahu government has attacked and weakened civil society organizations in Israel, groups that defend human rights and women's rights and civil liberties, the rights of Palestinians, both Israeli citizens as well as those in the territories. Such activists on the left and those committed to what we would consider to be liberal civil society organizations in Israel are now often branded as traitors or agents of foreign governments. As the settlements in the occupied territories expand and become more entrenched, right-wing nationalist sentiment grows and pervades Israeli society and its politics. So, how are we to explain this upsurge of nationalism and authoritarianism, which is so widespread around the world? Well, in the United States, as is often discussed, and I know I've given several platforms addresses on this, it's combined with an ugly commitment to xenophobia. Paradoxically, as America has become more diverse, ethnically, racially, linguistically, and culturally, and most likely because of it, there is a virulent hatred expressed against the immigrant, the minority, the person of color, which is spurred on by Donald Trump and the extraordinary legitimating power and authority he brings as president. While asylum seekers are fleeing pervasive danger and violence in Central America as they were approaching the US border seeking refuge just last week, Trump was accusing them of potentially violating our laws, when the right to seek political asylum from danger are very much in accordance with American law and are also in accordance with our treaty obligations under international law. It was another expression of Trump's pervasive scapegoating of the most vulnerable people for the sake of scoring brownie points with his constituency. I personally think it's very ugly. It's a negation of our nation's highest ideals, and it personally makes my skin crawl. I mean, you've read about this, not in terms of asylum seekers necessarily, but immigrants, mothers and children who come across the border seeking lives. They are now separating children, small children, from their parents. There is something very ugly about that, I find. And again, I'm not making substantive equivalents, but you know, I had relatives who were walked into gas chambers. The optics of it have a feel of the Gestapo. There is something about this moment of rounding up immigrants, many of which who are deliberately targeted, many who have been here for a long time, in what in effect is an intimidation campaign that has with it a sadistic edge. Okay, I think it's really very, I don't use this term very often, it feels to me very un-American at least. I mean, this is not what this country should be doing. It's not what it's about. Well, tagged to this xenophobia, the lines of hatred are drawn around people with opposing political viewpoints. As is often noted, American politics has become drained of nuance and intelligence. People are divided into warring camps based on the political views they hold. Politics has become virulently tribal, and the political position a person holds on a specific issue, whether it be abortion or gun control, Obamacare, or other programs, really declares where you are. To declare that you are for or against a particular political point of view or ideology is to virtually pledge allegiance to that constituency or cohort that asserts and stands for that point of view. Nuance, specifics, and details simply have nothing to do with it. Democracy at its core is built around engaged disputation and debate. It requires a back and forth exchange of different viewpoints and then arriving at a compromise that may totally satisfy no one, but which everyone can live with. While engaging adversarial positions, democracy is built around the norm that though I disagree with your opinion, I respect your right to have it. Recognizing as well that you will win and lose some, and though you may be a loser today, you may be a winner tomorrow. However repudiated the ideas of one's opponent may be, democracy recognizes that one's opponent has a right to be here no less than you do. Mutual disagreement does not equate to mutual annihilation. By contrast, today's political climate has a take no prisoners feel to it. It is win or lose at all costs and sustains the ethos that the people I disagree with are written off the map and have no legitimacy in being part of this country. It is as if American society is comprised of warring enemy camps that make dialogue, discussion, mediation, compromise, all mainstays of democracy, virtually impossible. And I would say, unless the situation changes, I believe that the days of democracy in our great nation are indeed numbered. Okay. The looming questions are, how do we arrive at this point, and how can we possibly get beyond it and assure that democracy does not fade, but thrives in the American future? In a sense, this is a single question, in that the solutions to our problem, I believe, are to be found in the conditions that have created it. The problem goes beyond the fact that democracy does not seem to work well anymore. Just look at the stagnation of Congress and the alienation people feel from government and political leaders. Beyond the dysfunction, however, and even worse, is a felt disenchantment with the very idea of democracy itself. That's what's more problematic. I was brought up to believe that democracy based on the will of the people was not only the fairest form of government, but undoubtedly the best. This fact was virtually, to me and to so many Americans, virtually self-evident. Yet, as Yascha Mounk, a lecturer at Harvard, a guru of democracy's decline, and the author of a recently published book, quote, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, has noted the following, quote, citizens are less committed to democracy than they once were, while more than 2/3 of older Americans say that it is essential to live in a democracy. For example, less than 1/3 of younger Americans do. They are also more open to authoritarian alternatives. 2 decades ago, for example, 25% of Britons said that they like the idea of a strongman ruler who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. Today, 50% of them do. And these attitudes are increasingly reflected in our politics. From Great Britain to the US and from Germany to Hungary, respect for democratic rules and norms has precipitously declined. No longer the only game in town, democracy is now deconsolidating, end quote. Well, while I was brought up believing that democracy was clearly the best form of government and there can be no acceptable alternative, if we look at this question globally, this is no longer true. Considered globally, increasing numbers of people are finding more attractive authoritarian regimes as long as they can deliver the goods, so to speak. In various societies, and most fretfully our own, there is a yearning for so-called strong men who confidently provide simple solutions to society's complex problems. And I should say parenthetically, this yearn for a strong man goes along with heightened misogyny in our culture, but that's better left for another time. That's a different sort of offshoot, different discussion. It is this yearning commensurate with authoritarianism, which is the red meat for xenophobia, racism, nationalist, blood and soil purity, and for scapegoating. These are the conditions that pertained in 1930s Europe, and though we are not there yet, these are the conditions that we see emerging in many places around the globe, and again, right here in the United States. So how do we account for this? And what is the response if the decline of democracy is to be reversed? Well, the causes are complex. We've heard a lot about political tribalism, which speaks to the power of being part of a politically defined group, even if that allegiance works against one's own economic self-interest. This sociological phenomenon is very galling, very stubborn, and very difficult to successfully respond to because it is virtually impervious to facts, evidence, and reason. Hence, we have the flourishing of alternative facts, the unquestioned defense of lies, the post-truth era, and other manifestations of irrationalism, the flourishing of which in time will make the existence of any coherent society simply impossible. If a college-educated scientist expounds on a confirmed scientific fact, many people today will reject it, not because it's objectively false, but because the one who is expounding it is an exponent of the East Coast liberal establishment who holds people like us, so to speak, in contempt, and so we will reject his utterances with contempt of our own. In other words, it's tribalism all the way down. Well, maybe not quite all the way down. Maybe not all the way down. As much as I affirm the tremendous power of the group bond and the power of group identity to simply overwhelm reason, the truth, facts, evidence, and all else, I think we can peel away the skin of the onion and dig down even deeper. When we look at those conditions under which democracies have grown and flourished, we see an interesting correlation, which I believe is also causative. Generally speaking, democracies have flourished when economies are doing very well, and democracies have retreated when economies have not been doing well. Okay, that's an important correlation here. Ronald Inglehart, whom I quoted before again, makes a pertinent observation. Quote, "To a large degree, the shifts between democracy and authoritarianism can be explained by the extent to which people feel their existence is secure. For most of history, survival was precarious. When food supplies rose, population levels rose with them. When food supplies grew scarce, population shrank. In both lean and fat times, most people lived just above the starvation level. During extreme scarcity, xenophobia was a realistic strategy. When a tribe's territory produced just enough food to sustain it, another tribe moving in could spell death for the original inhabitants. Under those conditions, people tend to close ranks behind strong leaders, a reflex that in modern times leads to support for authoritarian xenophobic parties, end quote. Very interesting anthropological historical observation. Speaking personally, now that I have reached this stage of life, okay, it's become clearer to me how economically privileged I have really been. Okay, maybe I needed the perspective of age to be able to make a comparison between then and now. Okay, this is what I mean. I was born after World War II, spent my childhood in the 1950s, came of age in the 1960s. It was a time of great economic growth, not only here, but in post-war Europe and Japan. The economy was assuredly at my back, and as a result, I could choose, and choose is just the right word, a career in the ethical culture movement, okay, which assuredly has not made me rich, but throughout the 70s and 80s permitted my wife and me to raise 6 children, see 5 of them through college, 3 of the 5 attended private colleges, and we saw 1 child through medical school, a 2nd child through law school, and the 3rd pursued a doctorate, okay, at Rutgers in social psychology, okay, which we were able to help out with along the way. And at that time, believe me, as a leader in the ethical movement, I was making when my kids were in college, a very modest salary. I don't remember, but it was certainly somewhere under $40,000. And my wife was a psychotherapist working primarily with the poor, who in effect sometimes was not paid at all, did not accept anything from her clients, and so on. And I felt honored that I could support my wife in the very important work that she did. Our incomes were they were middle-class incomes. We supported a big house, but in effect they were very, very modest, and we were able to see 5 kids through college, including 3 through private schools and 3 through graduate programs. We were able to do that at that time, okay. It was hard, believe me, and it was a strain which involved very tight money management. But my point is, back then it was doable. By contrast, I doubt very, very much I could do it today without drowning myself in a lifetime of reckless, overwhelming debt that I could never work myself out of, okay? The economic environment was certainly very different from what it is now, all right? Am I being clear about that? I mean, yes. Okay. Ronald Inglehart again confirms my personal experience when he notes, in rich countries, many people after World War II grew up taking their survival for granted. They could do so thanks to unprecedented economic growth, strong welfare states, and peace between the world's major powers. That security led to an intergenerational shifts in values, as many people no longer gave top priority to economic and physical security and no longer felt as great a need to conform to group norms. Indeed, they emphasized individual free choice. That sparked radical cultural changes, the rise of anti-war movements, advances in racial and gender equality, greater tolerance for LGBTQ community and other traditional groups. End quote. That could be me, you know, in terms of the choices that I've made. Type of cosmopolitan sensibility, a life based on causes that I choose to take, and not having to worry very much about economic security and survival because the wind was at my back, so to speak. Okay. Now, one thing, and I think it's important to mention, I've looked for, but I have not been able to find questions of wealth disparity back in the 50s and so on as it pertained to the African American community. Okay, I'm talking, this really does pertain to the culture at large. If we look at minorities, I couldn't find any data on that, but I would suspect that with the significant move of a large percentage of the black population after the Great Society programs of the Johnson era into the middle class, I would assume, and this is just a presumption, would have to be verified by the data, I would presume that the wealth disparity between in the African American community now is much greater than it was back in the 50s when there was more universal poverty, and now you have a greater distance between those who have successfully moved into the middle class, which is half the black population. I mean, the Great Society program was very successful in terms of enabling a lot of those people to move, African Americans to move into the middle class, leaving the truly disadvantaged behind, so the gap is larger today, I believe, than it was back then within minority communities. Anyway, Englewood's point is that economic security allows for people to engage interests beyond their economic survival needs and becomes the incubator of cosmopolitan and democratic values. He could have been describing me with my involvement in the anti-war movement, the ACLU, Amnesty International, human rights, and the ethical culture movement, democratic preoccupations that have nothing directly to do with economic survival, because I was free from having to worry about economic survival. I could become an East Coast liberal elite cosmopolitan, you know, which is effectively what I am, I guess, right? And most of you, all right? No innocence here, guys, all right? Everybody's part of a tribe, and that's my tribe, that's your tribe, and so on. I suspect most of you. It has been the flourishing of such cosmopolitan preoccupations, in fact, that have more recently, as we know, created a backlash among other people who hold less secure positions in society, are less well educated and less well off, and those who have felt that their family and religious values have been threatened. This sense of alienation has been compounded by a large influx of immigrants, so that the country that such folks occupy doesn't feel like the country that they were born into. Today, the economic environment is radically different from the one that I experienced as a child and as a young person. And the linchpin, this is the central point of my address, the linchpin of that difference is the extraordinary income and wealth gap in the United States, and to varying degrees in other advanced countries. If I had to point to one toxic element that erodes and threatens our democracy and makes authoritarianism more possible, it is that, the wealth gap. Donald Trump may tell you how great the economy is and how unemployment is now below 4%. What he won't tell you is the real picture. First of all, the unemployment figures have dropped because fewer people are indeed working, and many have given up looking for work altogether. And many who are working are barely surviving in very low-paid jobs with no benefits, no security, and many are working part-time in crappy jobs, you know, hoping that they would get something better in the future. The great transformations of the economy came with Ronald Reagan, who all but destroyed labor unions that helped to build and sustain the middle class, and he sharply cut back on state regulation while ensuring that disproportionate wealth went to the already wealthy and super wealthy, all justified by trickle-down economics, which never worked and never will. It was Reaganism that started us on the road to this wealth inequality which we experience today and which is eroding our democracy. Let me quote one last time from Ronald Inglehart's article. He says, as long as everyone was getting richer, rising inequality did not seem to matter very much. Some people might have been rising faster than others, but everyone was moving in the right direction. Today, however, everyone isn't getting richer. For decades, the real income of the developed world's working classes has been declining. 50 years ago, the largest employer in the United States was General Motors, where workers earned on average about $30 an hour in 2016 dollars. Today, the country's largest employer is Walmart, right, which in 2016 paid about $8 an hour. That differential tells it all, okay? Less educated people now have precarious job prospects and are shut out from the benefits of growth, which have overwhelmingly gone to those above them, end quote. And then there is the huge loss in jobs that has come with automation and computer programming, which further undercuts the growth of large numbers of secure, well-paid jobs. Indeed, between 2000 and 2010, 85% of manufacturing jobs were eliminated because of technological advances, and only 13% because of trade, despite what Donald Trump may tell his followers. Okay, much of the job loss not because manufacturing going overseas, which it has, but because of technological and automation changes. That's what's the main driver. Yes, brute numbers may tell us that unemployment is down, but these numbers conceal the fact that in the United States, 94% of the job growth from 2005 to 2015 was among low-paid security guards, housekeepers, janitors,
and others who report to subcontractors. Another fact, for every unemployed American man between 25 and 55, another 3 were neither working nor looking for work. Work rates for women have also declined. The human toll of all this depleted work situation is deep and broad and very painful. Nearly half of the working age male labor force dropouts, male labor force dropouts, roughly 3.5 million men took pain medication daily in 2016. Death rates are rising sharply for non-Hispanic white men with high school degrees or less. So-called deaths of despair, suicide, cirrhosis of the liver, and drug overdoses account for most of the increase. As a result, life expectancy for all Americans has slightly declined. The average life expectancy in the United States has actually gone down, and it's gone down because of the massive numbers of people dying of opioid addictions and overdoses. That's actually brought down the number of the entire population in terms of how long you can expect to live in America on average. 2 other anecdotes I just want to share because they really moved me in terms of showing how hollowed out this society is becoming. You know, we don't recognize it living in the Northeast, but there are parts of this country that live under third world conditions and have been hollowed. I remember reading, just maybe you saw it too in the New York Times, there were 2 articles that caught my attention. One was about the situation in eastern Tennessee. Tennessee is one of these states that rejected Medicaid. So there are 160,000 people without Medicaid. And in effect, the opioid addiction in eastern Tennessee is absolutely rampant. And this article focused on the phenomenon of intravenous drug users, people who inject opioids, basically coming down with what's known as endocarditis, which is a bacterial infection of the heart valve. And the only way it can be cured is through open heart surgery. And this condition is becoming rampant among people in eastern Tennessee. And the situation is just awful. That in effect, and the article it interviewed several doctors who talked about ethical dilemmas. The condition is very expensive to treat this. You have to have open heart surgery, and then you need 6 weeks of antibiotics and follow-up treatment and so on and so forth to overcome it. And they said, and these people don't have health insurance. And so basically what happens is the health providers say, okay, we'll do this once, okay, but if you can't kick the habit, that's it, okay? In other words, you're gonna die. If you come down with endocarditis again. We're not going to do an open heart surgery a second time. And of course, the tragedy is that the facilities don't exist in terms of clinics. The only thing that people can find are places they go where they get abstinence preached to them, but no real support to get over their opioid addiction. Say, my goodness, this is what this country is coming to. There was another article, which I thought in a different vein, I guess it was Arizona, where it said that the public school systems are now hiring teachers, public school teachers from the third world, from the Philippines to teach in elementary school. Why? Because the wages for teachers are so low they can't attract people. Public school teachers in a lot of states have to live on food stamps or drive for Uber or whatever to supplement their income. And so they're now looking for people from the third world, not to be healthcare workers, to work at home health aides or whatever the case may be, but to be elementary school, public school teachers. I mean, this is what somebody should tell Donald Trump America can't be a great society if it doesn't have an educated society. And this, in effect, is where the current economy is leading. We could go on and on with a lot of other really distressing stories, but let me close. In closing, let me say that the solutions are illuminated by the problem. If we want to save American society, we need to close the wealth gap. Unless we can build new political coalitions that represent the 99%, that's you and me, the economies of the rich countries will continue to hollow out, economic security will decline, and the call for simplistic solutions and authoritarian government will grow. In short, political stability will require greater emphasis on policies that redistribute wealth, policies that in fact dominated most of the 20th century. Among other things, we need a politics that will bring into being a more progressive income tax and reverse the dynamics that were just reinforced by Trump's tax, which will be a continued giveaway to the wealthiest who need that money the least. With regard to automation, and this is really tough, government needs to intervene to create meaningful jobs that will, humanists that we are, that will require a human element in education, healthcare, research, the arts, and humanities. The greatest challenge we face is recreating government whose top priority is the improvement of the quality of life for all and not the maximization of corporate profit. Can this happen? Well, democracy has been in trouble before and has rebounded and has been restored. In the final analysis, the saving of American democracy demands effective leadership, smart organizing, and the mobilization of political will. In these times, this is, friends, and will remain our greatest challenge. Thank you.